We configured advanced AIs into Palestinian and Jewish experts. Then we gave them a debate forum and added 15 AI models to judge each round. No human emotions here, just solid arguments. Stick around to see who wins, but don't cheat yourself by skipping ahead. This debate is structured into 3 pivotal eras to provide a comprehensive understanding of the current Israel-Palestine conflict. Round 1 kicks off at the very beginning, the ancient Near Eastern period.
Jewish claims to the land stem from the Israelite monarchy, 10th to 9th century BC. Contemporary sources, the Tel Dan stele, Mesha stele, and Neo-Assyrian records confirm an Israel or House of David state participating in ancient Near Eastern diplomacy. This external recognition granted significant legitimacy under ancient norms. Unlike prior inhabitants, Canaanites and Philistines, Israel established an internationally recognized monarchy with stable dynasties. Recognition by major empires, Egyptian, Assyrian, Aramean, established Israel as a legitimate state, forming the foundation for enduring Jewish historical and cultural connection to the land.
While the Israelite monarchy held diplomatic recognition, earlier inhabitants have compelling claims based on chronological precedence. Archaeological evidence at Megiddo, Hazor, Ashkelon, and Ekron shows centuries of pre-Israelite occupation. Genetic studies link modern Palestinian Arabs to ancient Levantine populations. First occupancy carries moral weight regardless of diplomatic status, and evidence suggests modern Palestinians partially descend from these earliest inhabitants. Thus, recognized kingship does not override claims based on original settlement and genetic continuity.
Now let's move into the cross-examination for round 1.
You mentioned that Canaanites and Philistines didn't coalesce into a long-standing monarchy, but the Philistine pentapolis, Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, Gath, persisted for centuries and had a formidable cultural presence. Why should a crown outweigh the significance of stable city-state confederations that predate Israel's monarchy?
While earlier groups existed, the establishment of the Israelite monarchy marked a decisive historical turning point. In the ancient Near East, recognized kingdoms held unmatched diplomatic and military power, driving trade, defense, and the development of infrastructure like Solomon's Temple, creating a lasting impact on the region, unlike less centralized entities. Monarchies defined sovereignty and dictated how empires engaged with the region, solidifying enduring political and historical authority. The Merneptah stele, 1208 BC, references Israel, albeit as a people or entity rather than a well-defined kingdom. Some scholars argue that this mention indicates an Israelite presence even earlier than the monarchy. Does that not undermine your claim that prior inhabitants had priority if Israel was already recognized in Egyptian records by the late 13th century BC?
The Merneptah stele's reference to Israel is ambiguous. It could signify a tribal confederation rather than a centralized state. Meanwhile, Canaanite settlements in Jericho, Megiddo, and elsewhere date back to the Bronze Age, well before 1208 BC. So an incipient Israelite identity might have existed, but the land was hardly vacant. Merneptah's text alone doesn't prove overshadowing of older populations. Let's consider the biblical accounts of Joshua or David driving out native peoples. If the Israelite narrative itself concedes displacing prior inhabitants, how can you use that monarchy to justify a modern claim without addressing the ethical dilemma of an original displacement?
Conquest and displacement were constants in the ancient Near East, as evidenced by the Amarna letters, 14th century BC, which document relentless conflicts and shifting alliances among Canaanite city-states. The Assyrian and Babylonian empires later displaced entire populations, including the Israelites. In this context, establishing a recognized kingship was the cornerstone of legitimate governance and cultural identity. While modern ethics may critique ancient conquests, they do not diminish Israel's pivotal role in shaping Jewish history and identity. Some modern DNA studies indicate strong genetic continuity between contemporary Lebanese populations and Bronze Age Canaanites. If a similar continuity exists for some Jews, especially Mizrahim, how do you maintain a genealogical distinction between Palestinian inhabitants and Jewish diaspora groups? Might they both be Canaanite descendants in a broad sense?
If genetic data shows broad continuity across Levantine peoples, it complicates an exclusive Israelite claim. We should then see modern Palestinians, many with deep Levantine ancestry, as equally inheriting that legacy. A genealogical overlap does not nullify the occupant claim of the population that remained consistently in situ. You put great emphasis on external recognition, but how do you address potential bias in ancient imperial records? Conquering powers, like the Assyrians, often documented vassal states they found most valuable to subjugate, ignoring smaller enclaves. Could the near silence on Canaanite or Philistine polities reflect a documentary bias rather than true overshadowing?
Documentary bias is always possible. However, the consistent references to Israel or Judah across multiple empires, Egyptian, Assyrian, Babylonian, suggest it was more than just a random vassal. Diplomatic correspondence and tribute lists show a recognized monarchy. Smaller enclaves may not have garnered the same attention, which in turn signifies lesser standing in the ancient Near East political hierarchy. The Mesha Stele reveals the Moabites' perspective on their conflict with Israel, acknowledging Israel's expansion. Yet it also underscores Moab's right to territory. Doesn't that illustrate how multiple groups claimed land simultaneously, making an exclusive first occupant versus recognized monarchy dichotomy too simplistic?
The Moabite example highlights competing claims and shifting borders, demonstrating that the land was never truly empty. This is why earliest occupancy holds moral significance. Establishing a monarchy often required displacing existing communities. History shows that no single monarchy can erase the diverse lineages of those who lived there before. The biblical tradition traces Israelite ancestry to patriarchal migrations, such as Abraham's journey from Mesopotamia. How do you reconcile the idea of a native monarchy with the fact that the earliest Israelites themselves may have been migrants? Doesn't this blur the distinction between original inhabitants and newcomers who formed a kingdom?
The ancient Near East was a region of migrations, conquests, and shifting populations. Earliest doesn't automatically translate to an exclusive or superior claim in this dynamic context. Ancient identities were fluid. Many peoples emerged from older stock. The crucial point is that the Israelite monarchy, regardless of initial migrations, was recognized as a legitimate, centralized authority with deeply rooted cultural traditions. Over centuries, that monarchy's legacy morphed into Jewish religious and ethnic identity. So the monarchy remains historically pivotal, even if the earliest Israelites were themselves once newcomers. Consider religious ties. The Hebrew Bible recounts the covenant between God and the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, granting their descendants the land of Israel.
The Hebrew Bible reflects the religious beliefs of the Israelites, but it's important to recognize that other groups, such as the Canaanites, had their own long-standing spiritual traditions tied to the land. The existence of diverse religious narratives highlights the multifaceted spiritual significance of the region to various peoples over time. Archaeological findings, such as the Ugaritic texts, reveal that Canaanite religious practices were well established and widespread across the Levant. Sites like Ugarit, Byblos, and Hazor had significant temples and cultic centers that were central to the religious life of their respective city-states and regions. Doesn't this suggest that the spiritual claim to the land by its earlier inhabitants was both deep-rooted and pervasive?
Canaanite religious practices were polytheistic and included elements such as human sacrifice. However, their traditions did not evolve into a cohesive or enduring religious system. The centralization of worship in Jerusalem and the construction of the first temple under King Solomon were pivotal in solidifying Jewish religious practices in the land. The prophetic tradition in Judaism, with figures like Isaiah and Jeremiah, reinforced the idea of a divine promise to the Jewish people, even during periods of exile. Doesn't this establishment of a central religious institution demonstrate a formalized and enduring spiritual claim to the region?
The First Temple and prophetic traditions are significant in Jewish history, but they do not erase the deep spiritual claims of earlier peoples like the Canaanites, who established sacred centers long before Jerusalem's rise. These decentralized but widespread practices show that the land's significance was never exclusive to one group. Palestinians, as descendants of those who remained in the region through conquests, embody this enduring connection. The land's sacredness extends beyond Judaism, with Islamic and Christian traditions also tying Palestinians to it. Any discussion of rightful ownership must account for this shared and pluralistic spiritual heritage.
Let's turn to our panel of AI judges. In round 1, Llama 3.3 stated the pro-Palestine debater won by presenting a more nuanced and multifaceted argument that highlighted the complexities of ancient history, the legitimacy of prior inhabitants' claims, and the moral weight of first occupancy. In contrast, Claude believed the pro-Israel side prevailed with their compelling evidence of the Israelite monarchy's diplomatic recognition by major powers and how ancient Near Eastern legitimacy was primarily determined through recognized kingship rather than earliest occupancy. In this round, the majority of judges agreed with the pro-Israel argument.
Round 2, baby, round 2!
We now move forward in time to examine how these competing claims evolved during medieval and early modern periods.
From late antiquity to medieval and early modern times, the political landscape underwent vast changes, from the Christian Byzantine Empire to Islamic administrations, culminating in Mamluk and Ottoman dominion. During this period, 7th century AD onward, Arabic-speaking Muslim communities became the regional majority, alongside indigenous Christians, Samaritans, and smaller Jewish enclaves. Observers like Nasir Khusraw and Ibn Battuta document thriving local Muslim and Christian towns, reflecting a culturally rooted and demographically significant Arab presence in Palestine. Ottoman tax registers, tapu defters, from the 16th and 17th centuries further confirm stable Arab settlements cultivating fields and vineyards across the region. By contrast, the once robust Jewish polity was no longer a sovereign power. Jewish communities remained, but were comparatively small. Such long-standing occupant continuity, spanning centuries of unbroken residence, forms a powerful basis for present-day Palestinian claims.
The term Palestine originates from the Roman renaming of Judea to Provincia Syria Palestina after the suppression of the Bar Kokhba revolt deliberately designed to erase Jewish ties to the land. Many Jews were exiled, sold into slavery, or sought refuge in other countries, resulting in the widespread phenomenon known as the Jewish diaspora. Despite later Arab-majority rule, Jews maintained continuous presence in Jerusalem, Tiberias, and Safed. In rabbinic literature from the Geonic period to the medieval Rishonim, we see ongoing references to the land of Israel as central to Jewish law and identity, including specific commandments like agricultural laws, applicable only in that land. Moreover, the Jewish diaspora maintained robust ties through pilgrimage, charitable endowments, and occasional resettlement. Figures like Doña Gracia Nasi in the 16th century financed Jewish enclaves under Ottoman rule, signaling continued Jewish aspiration to return and reestablish a foothold. Even in exile, Jews preserved their claim to sovereignty through religious, cultural, and physical ties to the land.
Now we move to the cross-examination of round 2.
You highlight small Jewish communities in Jerusalem, Tiberias, and Safed. Yet Islamic legal frameworks, particularly the dhimmi system, placed Jews and Christians under subordinate status, obliging them to pay special taxes and adhere to restrictive regulations. How does this subordinate standing undermine the notion of a robust Jewish continuity or right to reclaim sovereignty, given that Jews existed primarily at the discretion of Muslim rulers?
Jewish populations were indeed dhimmis under Islamic rule, but that status allowed them to remain in their ancestral locales rather than being expelled entirely. While unequal, it helped preserve Jewish communal life. Cairo Geniza records show Jewish communities engaged in extensive trade and intellectual exchanges with their Muslim and Christian neighbors. These intellectual and religious centers not only preserve Jewish traditions and texts, but also influence global Judaism, ensuring that the cultural and spiritual bonds to the land remain strong. Halakhic texts emphasize the importance of maintaining a continuous Jewish presence in the land, ensuring that even a small population could sustain spiritual and cultural ties. Ottoman land records from 1516 to 1917 show many Arab village populations were recent migrants from Egypt, Syria, and Lebanon, arriving after economic opportunities or fleeing conflicts. The so-called Arab majority of the time raises additional questions. Were these groups unified in identity, language, or culture, or did they reflect a mosaic of diverse communities with varying allegiances and self-perceptions?
While the term Palestinian as a modern national label emerged in the 20th century, this does not diminish the connection of these people to their land, their villages, and their cultural practices, which were passed down through generations. The Arab majority in Palestine, even if diverse in tribal or regional affiliations, shared linguistic, cultural, and religious commonalities that connected them to the broader Arab and Islamic world. These ties were reinforced over centuries, particularly under Islamic rule, where the Arabic language and Islamic practices became unifying features. While nomadic tribes and seasonal migrations existed, the core of Palestinian society was rooted in agricultural and urban communities that maintained a stable presence. The claim of continuity is not about uniformity, but about the enduring relationship of these communities to the land they inhabited and cultivated for generations. If Arabs overshadowed Jews numerically for centuries, doesn't this occupant dominance equate to a de facto sovereignty, even if not formalized as an autonomous monarchy called Palestine?
Numerical majority does not equate to recognized political statehood. Arabs never established an independent kingdom or emirate specifically identified as Palestine. While Jewish numbers declined at times, vibrant communities persisted in cities like Jerusalem, Tiberias, and Safed. While overshadowed demographically, These enclaves showcased a living tradition of diaspora-driven return. They foreshadowed the larger migrations that would occur only in the 19th and 20th centuries, proving that the monarchy-based narrative had never entirely disappeared from Jewish collective consciousness. Medieval Jewish texts, like the Letters of Maimonides, consistently highlight a religious obligation to dwell in the land of Israel, describing exile as an imposed condition rather than a voluntary choice. Given that diaspora Jews endured widespread persecution, forced conversions, pogroms over centuries, does this not strengthen the argument that their absence from the land was coerced, thus making the right to return inherently valid, even if local Arabs formed the majority for generations?
These texts demonstrate genuine longing, but they don't negate centuries of practical governance by Arab Muslims. The diaspora faced external pressures, yet occupant Arabs were likewise shaped by imperial rule, warfare, and shifting alliances. Majorities matter in historical practice. Those who physically dwell on and develop the land through agriculture, waqf endowments, and communal institutions often gain moral claims. When the diaspora is absent physically, for whatever reasons, occupant presence becomes the de facto stewardship. Halakhic discourse, while influential within Jewish communities, did not directly alter the fact that Arabic-speaking locals were maintaining the fields, towns, and markets throughout the medieval and early modern eras. Even in Jerusalem, central to Jewish identity, Islamic rulers like the Fatimids, Ayyubids, and Mamluks invested heavily in religious and civic architecture, the Dome of the Rock, the Al-Aqsa Mosque, and numerous charitable endowments. Doesn't that extensive physical and spiritual integration of Jerusalem into the Islamic world for centuries suggest a rightful and continuous occupant-based claim that modern Palestinian Muslims inherit?
Jewish ties to Jerusalem existed long before Islam. The First and Second Temples, key pillars of Jewish faith, predate Islamic construction by well over a millennium. Jewish pilgrims, including Benjamin of Tudela, 12th century, documented active Jewish quarters, and diaspora donations supported local synagogues. The continuous maintenance of Jewish holy sites, such as the Western Wall, and the operation of religious courts, Batei Din, ensured that Jewish legal and communal life remained integral to the city's fabric. The establishment of educational and scholarly institutions in Jerusalem also played a critical role in preserving Jewish intellectual and cultural contributions, fostering a vibrant community that influenced global Judaism. Archaeological and archival records show extensive trade networks between medieval Jewish communities in Palestine and Jewish merchants across the Mediterranean, along with shared religious texts, architectural styles, and educational practices. Meanwhile, rural Arab communities often operated in isolated, self-contained units with minimal regional connectivity. How does this contrast between Jewish interconnected civilization versus localized Arab settlements challenge Palestinian claims of cultural continuity and sophisticated governance?
Interconnectedness doesn't negate local claims. Palestinian Arab communities, particularly during the Islamic Golden Age, were integral to expansive trade networks that facilitated the flow of goods, ideas, and culture across regions. These trade relations connected the Arabian Peninsula to the Indian Ocean trade routes, influencing commerce in places like Aksum and contributing to the spread of cultural and religious practices. Archaeological and historical studies indicate that Palestinian Arab villages, such as Hamama, exhibited settlement continuity and adaptability from the Mamluk through the Ottoman periods. These communities demonstrated resilience and sustained cultural practices despite external pressures, indicating a sophisticated level of local governance and social organization.
Let's go back to our judges. In round 2, ChatGPT's latest model thought the pro-Palestine debaters' detailed accounting of uninterrupted Arab-Muslim presence and governance carried greater persuasive weight during centuries when local demographics and administrative control mattered most. Their evidence from Ottoman tax registers and travelogues gave them the stronger claim to occupant-based continuity in this period. In contrast, IBM's Granite 3.1 found the pro-Israel debaters' argument more convincing, noting they effectively countered their opponent's emphasis on Arab demographic majority by highlighting the enduring presence of Jewish communities in key cities like Jerusalem, Tiberias, and Safed, which preserved religious practices and legal norms central to Jewish identity. In this round, the majority of judges sided with the pro-Palestine arguments. In our third and decisive round, we explore how these competing claims erupt into modern, internationally mediated conflicts and legal frameworks.
The Zionist movement, rooted in the millennia-long Jewish connection to the land, gained momentum in the late 19th century as a response to European anti-Semitism. The Balfour Declaration and the League of Nations Mandate endorsed the establishment of a Jewish homeland in Palestine. After the Holocaust, global support for a Jewish state culminated in the 1947 UN Partition Plan, which proposed separate Jewish and Arab states. Jewish leaders accepted the plan and declared Israel's independence in 1948. Arab states rejected the plan and launched an immediate attack, initiating the Arab-Israeli War. Against overwhelming odds, Israel defended itself and expanded its territory beyond the UN allocation. The 1948 war solidified Israel's sovereignty and established it as a resilient nation amidst a hostile region.
From a Palestinian perspective, the Zionist project represents a colonial imposition that disregarded the overwhelming Arab majority in the region by the early 20th century. Promises of independence, such as those implied in the Hussein McMahon Correspondence, were betrayed by British imperial interests and the secret Sykes-Picot Agreement, which divided the Levant among European powers. The Balfour Declaration facilitated mass Jewish immigration to Palestine without local consent, creating tensions over land and resources. In 1948, the Nakba, the catastrophe, resulted in the forced displacement of over 700,000 Palestinians as Israel declared independence and expanded its territory during the ensuing war. The Arab states attacked Israel immediately, viewing its creation as an unjust partition imposed by foreign powers that violated the rights of Palestine's indigenous majority. UN Resolution 194 recognizes a right of return for Palestinian refugees, yet this remains unfulfilled.
Now we move to the cross-examination of round 3.
How can Israel claim a superior modern right to occupy the land when Palestinians maintained physical presence for centuries before large-scale Jewish immigration? Even if international law, via the UN Partition Plan, favored a Jewish state, how do you address the critique that occupant continuity, in principle, should outweigh diaspora claims after such a long period of Arab residence?
Occupant continuity alone doesn't determine sovereignty, especially when another group has deep historical ties and legal recognition. Jews maintained a presence in cities like Jerusalem and Safed, even under Ottoman rule, while international law, via the Balfour Declaration, League of Nations Mandate, and UN Partition Plan affirmed Jewish national rights. Palestinian residence for centuries is undeniable, but international consensus recognized both people's claims and proposed a two-state solution. Israel's creation fulfilled Jewish aspirations grounded in history and law, and its sovereignty was solidified through defense and global recognition, outweighing claims based solely on continuity. How do Palestinians respond to the argument that there was no long-standing push for an independent Palestinian state until the early 20th century, and that many in the region primarily identified with larger Arab nationalist movements, seeking union with Syria, rather than a separate national identity tied solely to Palestine?
Palestinian identity, like many modern national identities, crystallized in reaction to changing political realities. Under the Ottoman Empire, local affiliations often overlapped with broader imperial or regional identities, whether Syrian, Arab, or Ottoman. This does not negate a continuous relationship with the land itself. The 20th century's colonial partitions, Sykes-Picot, and the prospect of a Jewish national project in Palestine catalyzed a distinctly Palestinian nationalism. Moreover, the principle of self-determination does not require a historically static nationalism. It evolves as communities face new challenges. By the mid-20th century, Palestinians had developed coherent political structures, resistance movements, and cultural expressions that attested to a collective national consciousness. Attempting to dismiss the Palestinian claim because it's solidified in a particular historical context overlooks the dynamic nature of national identity formation worldwide. You say there was no unified desire for an independent Palestine, but large Arab populations existed there long before significant Jewish immigration. Doesn't dismissing Palestinian statehood aspirations contradict the very principle of self-determination applied to Jewish people?
Self-determination is indeed crucial, and Jews also had millennia-old historical, cultural, and religious ties to the land. When Zionist pioneers arrived in the late 19th century, they found a sparsely populated region plagued by malaria and underdeveloped infrastructure, an observation corroborated by travelers like Mark Twain, who wrote about near-empty landscapes and neglected fields. In many cases, Jewish immigrants bought lands from absentee landlords, drained swamps, and turned them into productive farmland. Arab populations also grew during this period, partly because of new economic opportunities arising from Jewish-led development. Earlier, you mentioned the colonial context of the Mandate and international resolutions, but Jewish immigration to Palestine in the late 19th and early 20th centuries often resembled other global migrations, such as to the United States or Australia, where persecuted groups purchased land legally, worked it with agricultural tools, and did not initially come with a colonial army. Why should Palestinians view these early Jewish settlers, many fleeing pogroms in Europe, as agents of colonialism?
Even if some Jewish immigrants purchased land legally, the broader framework was shaped by British imperial policy, the Balfour Declaration and the Mandate, which explicitly facilitated a national home for one group at the expense of the existing majority. Palestinian farmers and tenants often lost access to lands sold by absentee landlords residing in Damascus or elsewhere. While some settlers came with agricultural tools rather than weapons, their presence still aligned with imperial decisions that dismissed the political rights of local Arab communities. This colonial overlay, from a Palestinian perspective, taints the legitimacy of even those legal purchases. You argue that Israel has repeatedly claimed willingness to accept a two-state solution, yet Palestinians see each negotiation ending with insufficient concessions. How can you claim Israel genuinely supports two states when settlement expansions and control over Jerusalem continue to undermine the viability of a future Palestinian state?
Successive Israeli governments have indeed indicated willingness to negotiate a two-state framework. For instance, at Camp David in 2000, Prime Minister Ehud Barak made far-reaching proposals, including significant control over parts of East Jerusalem, a multi-billion-dollar compensation fund for 1948 refugees, and territorial compromises in the West Bank. Yasser Arafat, however, rejected these terms without presenting a detailed counterproposal. Prominent Arab leaders, such as Saudi Prince Bandar, even warned that Arafat would likely never get a better deal. Rather than continuing negotiations, Arafat allowed the Second Intifada to escalate, with suicide bombings targeting Israeli civilians. From the Israeli viewpoint, these attacks implied a preference for violent confrontation over compromise. Ongoing security threats have necessitated measures, like the security barrier, that Palestinians interpret as land grabs, but that Israelis see as essential defense. You reference the Nakba and the displacement of Palestinian Arabs in 1948, but how do you address the historical context of the Hebron massacre and other attacks predating Israeli statehood? Doesn't this suggest that from early on, local Arab leadership often pursued violence rather than coexistence?
Violence and tragic incidents, such as Hebron in 1929, must be viewed within the broader context of escalating tensions under the British Mandate. Palestinian Arabs felt dispossessed and saw the Mandate's facilitation of the Zionist project as an existential threat. Incidents like the 1929 unrest were partly fueled by rumors regarding Jewish intentions at holy sites. Palestinians see these clashes as reactive to rapid political, economic, and demographic changes imposed on them. While none of this justifies killing innocent civilians, it underscores deep fears of losing the land. The real cause was systemic marginalization and the sense that the Mandate authorities were favoring Jewish immigration at Arab expense. Israel often cites security needs as a justification for its military actions. However, from the Palestinian perspective, Israeli military responses, such as those during the Second Intifada and the current widespread destruction in Gaza, are viewed as disproportionate, counterproductive, and resembling collective punishment rather than legitimate acts of self-defense. How does Israel reconcile its right to security with the repeated instances of high civilian casualties, which not only fuel accusations of violating international law, but also risk undermining its moral standing and legitimacy on the global stage?
Israel's defense strategies are shaped by repeated attacks on its civilian population, suicide bombings, rocket fire, and other forms of terrorism. The October 7, 2023 Hamas attack on Israeli civilians was the deadliest assault on Jews since the Holocaust. The Israeli military response was, and is, focused on eliminating terrorist networks. Israel has taken more measures to avoid needless civilian harm than virtually any other nation that fought an urban war. Civilian casualties do occur in counterterrorism operations, but there is a fundamental moral and legal distinction between deliberately targeting civilians, terrorism, and inadvertently harming civilians during operations aimed at combatants. Terror groups often embed themselves in civilian areas, intentionally increasing the body count to attract international condemnation of Israel. From Israel's standpoint, it is forced into a no-win situation. Do nothing and allow Israeli civilians to be terrorized, or act militarily and risk civilian harm. How do you address claims that certain Palestinian organizations, labeled terrorist groups by many countries, deliberately provoke high civilian casualties on both sides to gain international sympathy, using a so-called arithmetic of death approach?
Hamas has undeniably used tactics that deliberately target civilians and provoke high casualties, as well as embedding military assets in civilian areas. These actions not only harm Israelis, but also expose Palestinian civilians to retaliation, perpetuating suffering and undermining the broader Palestinian cause. That said, many Palestinians do not support these methods. Nonviolent protests, such as marches and boycotts, demonstrate the possibility of civil resistance, though they often struggle to gain the same level of attention as violent incidents. While Hamas's actions dominate headlines, moderate Palestinian voices advocating for diplomatic and peaceful solutions are often overshadowed. Critics argue that the post-1948 and post-1967 acquisition of territories, especially the West Bank and East Jerusalem, went beyond the scope of self-defense and violated international prohibitions on acquiring land by force. Given these norms, how does Israel justify ongoing occupation and settlement expansion as a continuation of its modern right to the land?
Those borders emerged from a defensive war when Arab armies attacked following Israel's declaration of independence. In 1967, Israel captured territories in another defensive conflict, the Six-Day War. While UN Security Council Resolution 242 calls for withdrawal from occupied territories, it also affirms Israel's right to secure and recognize boundaries, leaving room for differing interpretations. Israel argues secure borders and negotiations are prerequisites for peace and has shown willingness to compromise, as seen in offers at Camp David 2000 and Annapolis 2007. Repeated rejections of partition proposals suggest an intransigent stance undermining Palestinian claims to sovereignty. Why have Palestinian leaders refused internationally endorsed two-state solutions if self-determination is their goal?
Rejections must be understood within the context of perceived imbalances and injustices. For instance, the UN Partition Plan allocated a disproportionate share of territory to a Jewish minority, at least in Arab eyes. Subsequent proposals, like Camp David 2000, were criticized for fragmenting Palestinian territory into non-contiguous enclaves, leaving issues such as refugees, resource rights, and sovereignty over East Jerusalem inadequately addressed. From the Palestinian perspective, these generous offers often lacked fundamental recognition of the right of return for refugees or full sovereignty over land that Palestinians inhabited for generations. Leaders feared that accepting such deals would legitimize an unequal status quo and fragment any potential state. Thus, what appears to outsiders as intransigence can be seen locally as a stand against further erosion of Palestinian rights.
Before we turn to our AI judges for the final verdict, each debater will deliver short closing statements.
Israel's right to sovereignty uniquely combines three elements: ancient sovereignty proven through archaeological and historical records, continuous connection through unbroken religious, cultural, and physical ties to specific places like Jerusalem for 2,000 years, and modern legal restoration through land purchase, institution building, and international recognition. Unlike other historical claims, Jews maintained documented presence from the Israelite monarchy through communities in Jerusalem, Tiberias, and Safed, while preserving specific laws and practices tied to this land even in exile. The Zionist movement translated this connection into legitimate state building through legal land acquisition, development of democratic institutions, and acceptance of partition. When faced with rejection and violence, from 1948 through October 7, 2023, Israel defended its sovereignty while consistently seeking peace. This synthesis of historical rights, legal process, institutional development, and demonstrated willingness to share the land through a two-state solution establishes Israel's legitimate right to exist as a sovereign state.
The Palestinian right to this land rests on the fundamental principle that a people cannot be justly displaced from territory they have continuously inhabited and developed for generations. From early archaeological evidence through centuries of documented Arab presence, Palestinians maintained majority presence and active stewardship of this land, building its towns, farming its soil, and forming its cultural fabric until systematic displacement began. While Jewish historical connections and minority presence are acknowledged, they cannot justify the colonial project that dispossessed Palestinians, first through British mandate policies, then through the Nakba of 1948, and continuing today through settlements that prevent a viable Palestinian state. Our claim combines proof of continuous majority presence, documented land ownership, governance until recent displacement, and the basic human right to resist dispossession from our ancestral homeland. No people should be made permanent refugees to accommodate another's return from diaspora.
Let's hear from our panel of AI judges one final time as we wrap up the debate. In round 3, Quen noted the pro-Palestine debater was slightly more persuasive by effectively critiquing the colonial nature of British and international policies that facilitated Jewish immigration and statehood, arguing that these actions disregarded the rights and presence of the Arab majority. The trauma of the Nakba and the ongoing challenges to Palestinian self-determination, such as settlement expansions and control over Jerusalem, present a compelling case for why Palestinian claims should be prioritized. In contrast, DeepSeek 3 supported the pro-Israel position, stating they effectively addressed critiques of Israeli security measures by distinguishing between deliberate terrorism and unintended civilian harm, while also highlighting the legal and historical foundations of Israel's statehood. Their emphasis on Israel's willingness to negotiate and the moral legal distinction between terrorism and self-defense provides a robust counter to Palestinian critiques. In a decisive ruling, 10 judges sided with the pro-Israel argument, concluding the debate with this perspective on top. Now it's your turn. What about you? Which side do you find more convincing? Share your perspective in the comments below.
We hope you enjoyed this discussion as much as we did. Subscribe for more engaging discussions and stay tuned for our latest content. Thanks for watching.